So I'm here at ASIM 19 with David Caldicott, the god of pill testing in Australia.
Stop your nonsense. Stop your nonsense, woman.
He gave a very, very popular talk this morning, a rollicking talk, one might say, about the history of cannabis in Australia, where we're at, the state of play, the state of you, as you said, David, as your Irish mammy would say.
It's true.
So can you give us a little bit of a snapshot of your talk this morning?
Sure. Well, I think, there's an awful lot of misconceptions about cannabis, medicinal or adult use in Australia. The medical profession, to a degree, is bought into that, sadly, but it's hardly surprising. You've got 100 years of hardcore prohibition, and if you want to provide a counter-narrative, it either has to be very powerful or it has to be there for a while. So it's hardly surprising that our misconceptions are what they are, particularly with the way that they've been fueled in Australia. And so we had a little look into the history of, and there's quite a lot of colonial history of cannabis use as a medicine in Australia, and then a little bit about some of the things that don't come out in conversations, some of the background. We're told that it's dangerous, we're told that it causes psychosis, but nobody tells us about the politics, both from the people who are against it and the people who are for it, and the huge sums of money involved. Yeah,
well, this was your kind of take-home message, I suppose, was that there's a pro-camp and there's an anti-camp, and both are sponsored, in fact, and where is the truth in all of this?
The truth is in the middle, as it always is somewhere. I mean, the medicinal cannabis, if used judiciously for the right patients, can have extraordinary results. It shouldn't be in the drinking water because it's definitely not the right thing for many people. And the truth is always somewhere moderately between the two extremes of both camps.
And what about the regulatory picture? I mean, that was your...
Look, it's a little disappointing, and it's not my observation, but the observation of many people, that there is an increasing chain of evidence to suggest that much of the reasoning behind why medicinal cannabis is where it is in Australia right now is concern regarding the perception that it could interfere with a multi-billion-dollar poppy industry based here in Tasmania. And so even members from regulatory bodies in Australia are now on record as saying that they don't want to do anything that affects the poppy industry. And you can see why. I mean, we are now providing 80% of the precursor, thebaine, to the manufacturers of some of the most addictive, most unpleasant drugs around the world. And that's $1 billion industry. So it's a far more complicated conversation than we're being led to believe.
You also, something I didn't know was that about the national pain strategy.
Yeah, so the influence, and I'll be talking about this again later in the week, but I would say to your viewers and your readers, if they ever want to know the influence that the pharmaceutical industry has on policy, health policy, there's a fabulous book called Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre, one of the great thinkers in the United Kingdom. And that's your starting point. And then come along and have a look at the last cowboy territories of regulation in Australia, where you can choose whether or not you want to be a member of the regulatory body that governs this or not. You can opt out and not follow the rules. Interestingly, and not something I've seen anywhere else in the world, the National Pain Strategy has received money from all of the manufacturers of opiates. And that is, I think that's a conflict of interest, don't you?
To put it mildly. Another issue that you're going to be speaking about that is very topical is pill testing.
Yes.
So we've just had the MDMA coroner's inquiry hand down the findings. She was very much in support of pill testing,
Sure.
emphatically so. And the ICE inquiries also come down in favour of this with this closing submission. So can you tell me a little bit about what you think the political climate and political appetite is, particularly given we're about to vote on this issue here in Tasmania?
Yes, today. So there's a big vote happening today. So actually there's extraordinary similarities between pill testing and climate change, I would say. And probably actually same-sex marriage as well in Australia, where you have a body, the same-sex marriage is obviously not so much a medical thing as climate change or pill testing, but you have an overwhelming body of opinion that is congruent in what they think should happen. So you have experts, expertise, evidence, all leading in one direction only. and for reasons that are varied, our elected colleagues choosing not to listen to both expertise and the opinions of the general population. So, yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, we're not at all surprised by the findings from the coronial inquiry, because that's what they do. They look at evidence. I think that's part of the problem with the politics, is that the evidence being ignored. And we're not actually that surprised by the emphatic nature of these findings. Again, for the same reasons. If you have an independent, intelligent group of people whose almost only job is to review evidence, of course, if the evidence is correct, they're going to arrive at a given finding. So, obviously it was going to end up that way. How we move politicians to be bold enough to apply that, that's politics. We've got to think about that.
What do you think the political appetite is?
I think that as far as drugs policy in Australia is concerned, our political colleagues are largely, with some exceptions, terrified. Absolutely terrified. I suspect, and I've heard too many times now, that they know that they're wrong, that they know that they're flying in the face of everything that they should be doing. And we're in a bad place in Australia at the moment. Now, Australia is not unique to it, but we're in a bad place where it's far more important to be elected than it is to show leadership. And I think that's what the problem is. And we have to demonstrate how electoral success can be associated with leadership, which is, not how it's working at the moment.
What's your read on what will happen in Tassie today?
Well, it's very interesting. I think it's very close. I think it'll be a political outcome, not a rational outcome. I think you have an ideological mindset among many of the conservative politicians in Tasmania. The Speaker is a remarkable woman, and he's quite happy to say what she thinks, and we know that she's very in support of pill testing. The most disappointment, I think, for me is the position that has been taken by the Labour Party, and I speak as somebody who has never voted in this country, but merely as an observation. Traditionally, the Labour Party in Australia has been one of supporting healthcare, supporting evidence. And my gut is that they're terrified, as they are across other jurisdictions in Australia, of being too closely associated with the Greens in ideology. Particularly, I suspect, in Tasmania, where the logging industry is so important. So I think, and I'm not sure, but I suspect the Labour Party might ride with the Liberal Party, which is an unholy, ungodly alliance. It's like mating a platypus to a camel. But I think that's what's going to happen. And yet again, it'll be another vote which will be closer to passing, but probably won't pass. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect that might be the case.
And what is the evidence on pill testing? I mean, you must be so sick of making the case. But
not at all. For you, anything. So it starts an awful long time back. Probably the first sort of evidence was drifting out from the early era of pill testing. I think a lot of people get very nervous in Australia because they see pill testing as something new and dangerous, but it's been over a quarter of a century elsewhere in the world. And damn it, I mean, I've been advocating for it in Australia for 19 years, so it's not new. But in 2001, there was some work that came out, the 3 Cities study, which shows that young people who are provided with pill testing tend not to mix their drugs as much and tend to take fewer drugs, both of which are risk factors for overdose. And that sort of data is emerging from everywhere now. We have seen the reduction, and part of the problem is that it's awfully hard ethically to set up a study where one of the outcomes is death of a young, healthy person. So that's bad form if we were to assign one group of people to an outcome that might include death. But what we can do is look at surrogate data. So we can look at things like hospital attendances, we can look at number of people turning up to medical tents, we can look at ambulance transports, and all of that data, including data from Australia now, from our own work, shows, we follow, say for example, one festival, and we follow Groove in the Moo because they're kind enough to collaborate with us. And if you look at various jurisdictions, the same people who go to Groove in the Moo all around the country. And you can compare the outcomes from Canberra to other jurisdictions where Groove in the Moo has been held. We had 2 ambulance transports in Canberra for one of the larger festival events. And one of those was for a security guard who hadn't had his breakfast. So we're making an impact. And I'd be daft to say it's just pill testing. What it is a commitment to make festivals safer. So we sit down with all key stakeholders and say, the deal is we're going to try for no deaths rather than no drug use. And when you change the focus in that way, and that includes pill testing, then you get better outcomes.
And what did you find with your own study at Groove in the Moo? What were your experiences there?
Oh, I think most importantly, stunning news, young Australians behave in the same way as other people around the world. So when you sit down with a young person and you tell them what's in their drugs, and in a very matter-of-fact way say, yeah, okay, well, that's what can happen to you if you take them, and chat to them about ways that they might want to change their behavior so they don't end up in the back of an ambulance, they change their behaviors so they don't end up in the back of an ambulance. So when we had a couple of substances which were probably pretty unpleasant, they binned them. But I think one of the mythologies, and it's too much now to expect that people are merely misunderstanding. People are misrepresenting what happens when their pills return a positive result for simple MDMA. It's very clear, and some work that was done in Portugal and Spain shows very clearly that even people who have their pills tested and return a result for straight ecstasy change their behavior. They may not take all of their drugs. They may, so I mean, nobody's God. Nobody can stop young people who've purchased drugs, stop them all using the drugs altogether. But we can definitely sway them towards not mixing the drugs, using fewer drugs, being a bit more cautious or abstemious in such a way that it prevents them from coming to harm. I'm on record, and I'll say it again. I'm not into the morality of drug use. I don't care. I don't have an opinion one way or the other. I'm not a priest. My gig is ensuring that they don't get harmed. And, your priests and your holy people can go and talk to them about drug use after I keep them alive. You can't have a lifestyle choice if you're not alive.
The inquiry into ICE has sort of made more than 100, or the closing submissions anyway, made more than 100 recommendations. And one of the ones that I thought was interesting was expanding the amount of licences in New South Wales permitted to medically supervised injecting centres, and also expanding the facilities so they're not just injecting but also different kinds of drug use. Permitting pregnant women and people under the age of, or between 16 and 18 under clinical kind of advice to also access these facilities. What are your thoughts on that, and what are your thoughts on whether that's at all likely to happen?
You see, all of those are evidence-based. There's no real debate among any expert globally anywhere on this. And so the movement, the MSIC, which is the term that has been used because that's how it's been used in Australia, is very much being replaced globally with this idea of a drug consumption room. From my perspective, I think that's an excellent idea, because you could, in fact, incorporate also pill testing in that environment as well. The business of drug checking or pill testing absolutely doesn't just have to happen at festivals. It probably should happen elsewhere. We're already working on that in the ACT. And that makes an awful lot of sense. But nobody has ever got rich in Australia betting on a politician taking a sensible approach to a policy involving drugs. And my fear is, if you look at, say, for example, Victoria, it took 4 coronial inquiries to get the MSIC up in Richmond there. And they're still getting stitched up. That'll be 2 inquiries now, but in a predominantly. Do you want to hold off?
That's fine.
Dickery.
We can keep talking.
Take. No. What we could do is throw them out the fucking window.
Don't say anymore.
No,
You're live.
That's it. It's all good.
Yes. What were you saying?
So. Where did I get to?
We were talking about MSIC and.
Oh yeah. So
it
took 4 inquiries in Victoria to get it off the ground. And the trick with politics, sadly, is to take all your good ideas and allow the politicians to think it was their idea. And so I suspect that, you know, one of the infantile aspects of all of this from a political perspective is that many of the politicians commentating on all of these things have completely painted themselves in a corner. It's not actually visible what their route out might be. Because if you hold up your old flintlock rifle and say, never, ever, ever are we going to do it, you're just going to get roundly mocked by your political opponents if you do. And I think a lot of that has happened in Australia, and I'm not sure. I mean, I'd be delighted if there's a way that I could help them out of the dumbass corners they've painted themselves in. I would do it in a flash. But, you know, there are certain things that we won't compromise on. So we will never agree to any pill testing that involves coercion. So the idea of testing products that are identified by undressing 12-year-old girls under the observation of sniffer dogs is reprehensible. That's got nothing to do with healthcare. That's unacceptable. So that would have to be something different. But generally speaking, we're pretty amenable to helping out if we can, as long as it involves good principles of healthcare.
Well, this was something that's been an emphasis of both of those inquiries. The kind of the law and order emphasis is inappropriate, and in fact is contributing to drug harm.
Well, I don't know if you saw today. I mean, the Chief Commissioner in New South Wales is calling for a return to an era where young people are afraid of police and know that there are consequences of breaking the law. There's no behavioural psychology behind that. That is an extraordinary sort of position to take for behaviour change. And it begs the question, who on earth are informing these people? Because there is a generation of young people in Australia whose respect for authority is diminishing directly as a consequence of this sort of policing. And that's going to come back and bite them in the ass soon.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting, as you say, to see how the politicians are going to find a way out of this situation, given there's been such, strong and unequivocal recommendations, particularly around policing, by Harriet Graham and by the ICE inquiry.
If you look at so clever politics, and kudos to them. The Queensland government, I have no evidence to think that they're going to move on anything soon. The race is too tight in Queensland for them to do anything that could open them to criticism. But politically, they've been very clever, and they've said, well, actually, we're not against it, we're not for it, we're going to wait for the evidence. Their problem is now that, there's a couple of inquiries coming out calling for it. They're going to have to make a call soon. But the political position taken in jurisdictions like New South Wales is actually baffling. What do they think the end game is going to be here? We have an out-of-control market. Young people are using drugs with impunity, with no message they're paying attention to. Of course there's going to be more deaths. What's going to happen when there are more deaths? Dumbass, fat Irish people like myself are going to stand up and say, hey, pay attention. And the parents are going to change this. I think disappointingly, again, the Victorians, their birthright is, politically to be in favour of reducing harm. But, the go-to message there is that our police colleagues tell us it won't work. There are over a dozen professional medical bodies who say otherwise. As soon as the law enforcement guys give me a taser and some cuffs, I let them make health calls. But until such time as they do that, I'm the doctor and they're law enforcement.
What's the future of pill testing if it doesn't get up as a policy?
That's not a possibility. Pill testing is going to get up. It's just a question of how much political damage political parties are going to do to themselves before it gets up. It's inevitable now, I believe, and we'll continue to paddle our own canoe in the ACT. We would love to collaborate with other parties in Australia on this. That doesn't look hugely likely at the moment. But I think that at some stage, another jurisdiction will decide that we can't hold on to these archaic opinions for any longer and say, oh gosh, look, the violets are in bloom. That tells me that I must do it now. It'll not be to do with any inquiry. It'll not be to do with any evidence, because there's more than enough of both. So they'll come up with some excuse as to why they implement it, and everybody will breathe a sigh of relief. The hope will be that no other family has to lose somebody before it is implemented.
But as you say, that's unlikely.
Yeah, I think, so there's probably a hierarchy of likelihood, and that is greatly dependent upon the influence of law enforcement in any given jurisdiction. There are some very powerful people in Tasmania who are backing it. The festival community in Tasmania are awesome. The peak drug and alcohol body here are awesome. So we are very interested in Tasmania. The Victorians, I think, have to go there eventually. We have no idea really when enough evidence will be available for Queensland. New South Wales idea when they're going to finally see sense about this is probably going to require a change in government.
So this has been a very interesting meeting so far, and not your typical fair.
Yeah.
It's been very political,
Yep.
and it's all about climate change, really, and also about activism and advocacy. You seem very comfortable in this space. You've sort of expressed
I've arrived.
those.
This is my home. Yeah.
So tell me what your thoughts have been so far, and what would you say to people who think that this is maybe a little bit inappropriate?
Look, I think we've seen that. There are members of government who, with regards to the Medevac bill, have told us to get back in our lane. This is our lane. You get back in your lane. We do healthcare, and it's actually far more important that we make sure that our patients are well than our politicians have a sense of well-being about themselves. So they can either deliver or not. And I think it's interesting, I've been around a while now, I'm old, and one senses a change, there's a sea change, there is a broader move towards activism outside of medicine. And so I think this move within our college, it's a young profession, emergency medicine, is a reflection of that broader movement. I think also a sense of responsibility that we must be there to support our patients to be. There are things that are happening in the world that will really have an impact on health. Climate change is one of them. And the advocacy element of that is just a natural extension of what we've always been as doctors.
You said to me that you're organising the next ASIM next year in Canberra. What are you going to do?
So I have no idea. God, we have to get elephants or something. It's just, they've really screwed the pooch for us. I really don't know how we can I love Canberra. There's lots of stuff to do there, but the bar has been set very high by the organisers here. So I got some ideas. I think there'll be rowdiness, but this is a real sea change for our college in Australia, and a very welcome one for particularly the younger members. You definitely, looking around, you would have seen yourself, there are people quite uncomfortable by a lot of the things that are being said and done. But the people who are uncomfortable represent an older generation, and I think you get the sense that the baton's been passed.
Well, there's going to be a march on Thursday.
Yeah.
From the hospital to here.
Yeah.
Will you be there? God,
yeah. Everybody loves a march, and particularly if it's for the right reasons. So these are important times. We are unduly influential in society. We are given, a respect that, for the most part, we don't deserve, and we need to earn that, and we need to make life uncomfortable for ourselves to represent what needs to be represented. We get to sign passports. We get, people pay attention to what we say, and you can't just kick back, speculate on your share prices and buy posh cars. There are important things that doctors need to do that is within the tradition of medicine since healing became a thing. And so I think it's within our college, our young college, there's been an awakening to that. And I, for one, I'm just reflecting earlier today, it's been a while since I've been as proud as I am at the moment to be an emergency doctor.
maybe a march on federal parliament next year?
Oh God, yes. Why not? Look, I think there is a very active environmental group for doctors in Canberra. I think the March for Science stuff is a fine example of the concerns that the citizen in the street has about the way we're being led. The values and the wishes of people in Australia are not being represented. It is largely a series of lobbyists holding up what Australians want across the board. There's no quiet Australian. God damn it. This is a confection to try to excuse inactivity. And I call bullshit on that.
I look forward to next year.